Okay, let's get on with it. Star Wars Apprentice of the Force for Game Boy Advance. Or if you want to go by the full title, Star Wars Trilogy Apprentice of the Force for Game Boy Advance. Nah, that sounds about as ridiculous as Street Fighter the movie The Game. Ugh. Anyways, this game was released in 2004 to coincide with the original Star Wars Trilogy's debut on DVD, waiting for people to spend their monies on and for fanboys to complain about even more alterations made to the Holy Trilogy. Or something to that extent. Whatever. So Apprentice of the Force is basically an abbreviated romp through the original Star Wars trilogies, told mainly through the perspective of Luke Skywalker as he progresses from whiny farm boy who was going to Tosh Station to pick up some power converters to newly minted Jedi Knight who just found out that Darth Vader was his father. Now, given how Luke initially reacted by this revelation, one would have to wonder how Luke would have reacted upon discovering that his father fell to the dark side because of weak love for Padme and because he killed children in his name or something, I don't know. Sort of like Obi-Wan Kenobi, old age and life as a blue ghost will mess with your memory, or something to that extent, but that's okay. It'll probably get revised in the next major release on a 4D memory cube, or whatever the big format happens to be in the next 10 years or so. I'm sorry, I'm getting off track here, my bad. So because the game's based on Luke's adventures and nobody else's, obviously you're only going to be playing as Luke Skywalker and won't be involved in any of the really cool stuff like flying the Millennium Falcon through the guts of the second Death Star, or flying through an asteroid field on either what remains of Alderaan or in the aftermath of Hoth. Of course, they made another game called Flight of the Falcon so you could participate in those fantasies, but I haven't played that one, and from what I've heard, response hasn't been favorable, but I digress once again. Controlling Apprentice is fairly simple fare. One button jumps, the other shoots, or uses the lightsaber in later levels, and you can swap between the blaster and the lightsaber anytime, even during the Jedi levels. As you progress, you'll gain additional abilities and force powers. Your dashing move, your double jump, your saber deflect, and healing powers, just to name a couple examples. You can slow down time if you want. And they work well enough for the most part. I'm not too keen on the blaster though. Shots are a bit slow for my tastes. It's generally a nuisance. The various blaster power-ups, which have limited ammo by the way, aren't all that great. They're just different colored blasts of varying speed and power. Nothing cool like a seeker gun or a flamethrower. And then there's the issue of shooting diagonally by holding a trigger button, which always felt a bit convoluted for me. Anyone who has played the Super Star Wars Trilogy on the Super Nintendo will recall the wonderful simplicity of firing in any direction by holding in that direction while firing. But then again, controller was generally much better in those games anyway. While Control and Apprentice is nowhere near as flexible or intuitive as I would have liked, it is responsive, and blaster issues aside, it's fairly simple to pull off some of the more advanced abilities on a whim, so on a whole, it's entirely workable. The main issue I have with Apprentice of the Force are the encounter points, the constant pauses where you get into a certain point in the level, and then a black border appears which indicates an ambush by stormtroopers, Tusken Raiders, or other foes. And you're basically stuck in this section of the level until you clear away X number of enemies, by which point the void will disappear and you can progress forward. Now when used in moderation, once per level, twice, maybe thrice, it makes for a good tense moment in a game, sort of like a mini gauntlet of sorts that you have to conquer before you can move forward. However, Apprentice abuses these ambush points to a, point where more than half the game comprises Luke getting trapped by the impenetrable black border of doom and having to fight in this stationary area, taking far too much time in one spot fighting endless enemies than perhaps exploring more of the level or partaking in more platforming. The more interesting aspects of the game, especially when you're trying to find a keycard or a switch to deactivate certain barriers or pull out a bridge or something. I don't mind playing a long game, but I like a game that's long for the right reasons and not artificial ones such as, well, this crap. Aside from the side-scrolling sections of the game, there's also a couple stages where you'll be controlling vehicles. There's the X-Wing level in deep space where you have to destroy a certain number of TIE fighters before being allowed to make the trench run. The trench run itself, along with the speeder chase in the Return of the Jedi portion of the game, is done in an overhead view, which might seem like a bit of a letdown because it's not a third-person 3D view, behind-the-view type thing like in Super Star Wars on the Super Nintendo, but that's okay. It's almost akin to the trench run in the NES version of Star Wars, which was also an overhead, thing, although it was overhead vertical, not overhead, or anyways. The difference between this trench run and that trench run on the NES is that on the NES side, you actually got to fire your torpedoes in the exhaust port, which is looks actually more than 2 meters wide, but that... Whereas in Apprentice, you basically have to avoid all the obstacles, survive the TIE fighters, and basically just survive. You don't even get to shoot the torpedo down the exhaust port. It's done for you in a cutscene. It's not very exciting. On top of that, the levels aren't all that fun. The deep space level where you're shooting down TIE fighters, that's probably the most enjoyable level in the game, even if it ends up being a bit frustrating at points. But these levels where you're avoiding trees and walls and stuff, not so much. It's just avoid this, dodge that, maneuver the TIEs or the enemy speeders behind you into an obstacle or barrier so that they'll crash and die. And these levels seem to go on forever with no end in sight, and with very little variety in these levels, the end result is pretty lame. Hey, speaking of lame, if you were wondering how the Game Boy Advance was going to interpret the Battle of Hoth, you know, the battle with the Imperial At-Walkers and the Snow Speeders and trying to defend the Rebel base long enough for the Rebels to escape to the space and stuff, if you were wondering how all of that was going to play out in a Game Boy Advance format, keep wondering, because there's no Snow Speeder segment in this game whatsoever. Basically, the way the Hoth battle plays out is that you're basically outrunning Imperial Walkers and avoiding their feet in order to escape back to the Rebel base. And that's it. You're not even trying to climb one of the walkers to take one down with a bomb or anything like that. You're just running away from the walkers and going back to base, which... I don't know, how sad is it that a battle of such significance in the narrative of The Empire Strikes Back be the entire focus of its very own Atari 2600 video game many years ago, and yet on a portable system many times more powerful than the VCS, skips the battle altogether. You don't even step into the cantina to meet up with Han Solo. Instead, you spend the time trying to find a shop to sell your trusty land speeder. Instead of swinging across a chasm on a thin thread with Princess Leia by your arms, you basically shoot a switch that activates a conveyor belt, and you cross the Brit like that. Lame. There's not much in terms of challenge in Apprentice. Aside from the occasional platforming and flaunting a force push, your main focus will be surviving these endurance rounds of boredom ad nauseum. You could try and put up a good fight with skill and grace, or you can just go in there button mashing with reckless abandon. Doesn't really matter in the long run, chances are you'll prevail anyways. And if you don't, no biggie, you have infinite lives. No, seriously, infinite lives. I don't know, I've played the game, I've died so many times, you know, at one point, I've never came across any game over screen per se. I think I've died about 20 times, you know, on one section, just for the hell of it, and no game over. You know, I just kept starting over that particular section of the level, and it gets to a point where the game becomes so boring that you'll just quit in frustration if you can't persevere. Just about the only time really where the game shows some sign of life is during the Darth Vader fights, which actually put up a good fight despite some interruptions here and there with dialogue boxes. In fact, if there's one strength to Apprentice of the Force, it's that it tries to accurately portray the original trilogy as best as possible in a video game format. There's little to no liberties taken when it comes to how events are depicted in the game, so there's no scene where Luke is flying his X-Wing shooting down Boba Fett in Cloud City, there's no exaggerated combat, there's no massive creations made specifically for the game, everything is true to form. So for somebody who holds movie the game faithfulness in high regard, Apprentice certainly scores some major points in that regard. However, while the designers may be applauded for trying to accurately follow the movies as best as possible, it is debatable as to whether this was a good approach or not in the long run of the game. Some would say so, others would not. I don't think it was such a bad idea, I just think the execution's not up to snuff. I would have preferred something a little more quicker paced and not something derivative of another Ubisoft game. You know, because apparently this uses the same engine as the Game Boy Advance version of Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. Or at least that's what I've read. I haven't played the other game, so I wouldn't know, but... anyways, the game ends once you beat all the levels or just quit altogether. And each episode in the trilogy takes about an hour to beat with all the busy work encounters that you'll be putting up with. But at the very least there's a save feature that saves your progress, and as you progress through the game you'll unlock pictures in the bonus section of the game, which are not bad for a GBA cartridge at least. Apprentice of the Force has a rather interesting visual style, aside from the neatly rendered yet repetitive level layouts and backdrops. All the active characters have this cel-shaded appearance to them, and the animation is quite smooth actually. I'm just not quite fond of the art style, however, especially a style that forgets to add faces to the human characters. The vehicle stages look a little better with nicer looking fighter models, but the levels themselves are pretty barren, repetitive, and almost sleep-inducing. In between levels are these cutscenes, basically still images from the movie accompanied by text narration from Luke Skywalker, the protagonist of our video game here. The movie images look to be decent quality, but are ruined by the unnecessary blue monotone and screen effects that are more tacky than enhancing. I honestly would have preferred plain Jane color imagery with text, and this tacky stuff would have looked a bit better. The soundtrack's alright I suppose, with respectable renditions of the classic soundtrack from John Williams. There's a nice touch in the game where the actual platforming elements feature somewhat calm, normal sounding music, but then it sort of shifts to something a little more tense during the ambush points. The rest of the sound effects are your usual recycled Star Wars sounds catalog. Blaster fire, engine wars, lightsaber sounds, your usual stuff. But they sound a bit less exciting than previous games, I don't know. Maybe it's just the way they're implemented, but sounds in Apprentice are kind of barren. Star Wars sounds are usually exciting, but I guess you need an exciting game to implement them in. Oh well. Star Wars Trilogy Apprentice of the Force is pretty monotonous busywork that may look pretty and sound good, but offers very little substance in terms of the gameplay. As a mindless hack and slash, it's serviceable at best, but as a mindless shoot 'em up, it's not fantastic, especially when you're stuck with a rinky-dink blaster that's about as useful as a dust ball. And buried beneath the constant interruptions of repetitive combat and choking of the Black Void lies a rather bare-bones but otherwise decent platforming game, and if the ambush points were toned down significantly or even eliminated altogether, and more focus was made on polishing the platforming elements, Apprentice of the Force would have been a far more enjoyable video game. But the constant interruptions of boring busywork along with the uninspired vehicle stages results in a game that falls a bit short of being something that could have been decent at the very least. Overall, I wouldn't go out of my way to look for this one unless you're into Star Wars and don't mind monotonous busywork, but even then this will probably hold your interest for only a short while before you get bored and decide to play something else.